Hi witches, I'm Blair Bathory, and this is the Something Scary podcast. Thank you so much for being here, whether this is your first time or you're one of the brave souls who join us every week. I hope you're all ready to go back to school after a spooky summer. I just wanted to say thank you from the bottom of my heart for being here and joining me every week to listen to the scary stories. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it, and it's been such a joy to do this every week for you. Tales of vengeful spirits and creatures enacting revenge from beyond the grave can be found all over the world. It was often believed that somebody wronged in this life would continue to shadowwalk the earth, stuck in purgatory until they were able to resolve their issues and dish out punishment to those who'd crossed them. And as with many stories, we can sometimes be left questioning who the real monster is. First, revenge is sweet, followed by justice is served. Then in our final story, a cursed headstone. Before we get to our stories, I wanted to ask if you would take a minute to rate and review this podcast. You can pause here and do it right now, or you can do it after you've listened. It's one of the ways you can help Something Scary continue to grow, and it only takes a minute. Thank you so much from me and the Scary Squad. We are incredibly grateful for the support of all of our listeners. So, want to hear something scary? Revenge from beyond the grave. You've likely heard the old adage, if you haven't got anything nice to say, then you shouldn't say anything. Maybe the world would be a better place if more people adhered to this mantra. But also, you never know for sure if the person you are speaking to has a dark secret, as in this story inspired by Lone Wolf. Vita's eyes seemed flecked with gold when the sun shone upon them and when she smiled. They were warm, inviting, and full of life. Now, however, as the sun began to set over the mountains, drawing a deep red wound across the sky, Vita's eyes flashed with anger. Anger that she had been cut off too quickly by some remarks her teacher had made, the culmination of weeks of barely veiled comments from someone who should have known better. Vita was less well off than most of the girls in her class. Her family could not afford the extra tuition, which was essential to take to pass the grade. But instead of helping the girl, her teacher seemed to revel in her continual downfall. "You'll have to spend another year in the 7th, said Mrs. Zimmerman. "And if you don't like that, you can find another school. Somewhere where it won't matter if your shirt is torn and your pants are dirty and your shoes are falling apart." Mrs. Zimmerman had delivered the speech to Vita in front of the entire class, coupled with what was supposed to be a good-natured smile. The rest of the girls tittered dutifully. Poor Vita, on the other hand, just sat miserably at her desk. Only her eyes betrayed her true emotion, how angry she felt at the way the teacher treated her. On the way home in the gathering gloom, Vita's two friends, Stella and Gloria, commiserated with her. "She's mean, old, and she doesn't care about anyone but herself," said Gloria. "Her laugh reminds me of a brain donkey," added Stella, who was more forthright. But Via wasn't really listening. Her eyes were fixed on some point in the far distant, where the trees danced in a silhouette against an evening sky that was growing brighter with every moment. The moon was rising, a full moon that made her blood tingle, skin prickle, and her hair seemed fuller and glowy. Her steps grew lighter, her limbs more sinewy as she moved quickly yet gracefully along the mountain path. Abruptly, she turned off, leaving her companions at the fork of the road. "I fancy taking the path through the forest," she said. Her friends were used to Vita's sudden whims. They knew she wasn't afraid of being alone in the dark. Still, the lateness of the hour made them nervous, and now holding hands, they hurried home along the open path. The path Vita chose took her along the forest, the crooked, tormented branches of the trees throwing twisted shadows. A jackal howled to the moon. A nightjar bird called from the bushes. Vita walked faster, with more purpose. not out of fear but out of urgency. Her breaths were like short, sharp gasps. Bright moonlight bathed the hillside as she finally reached her humble home on the outskirts of a village. Racing through the door, she nodded to her parents. They watched her head up the stairs, then they slowly opened a door marked basement and descended into the darkness. Vita went straight into her small room and flung open the window. Moonbeams crept over the windowsill, and her arms, which by now were already covered with thick, golden fur. Her strong nails shredded the rotten wood around the windowsill. Her tall, swishing ears pricked. Vita leapt out of the window, no longer a girl. The tawny leopard crossed the open fields behind the house, melting into the shadows. A little later, she padded silently through the forest. Although the moon shone on the tin-roof village, the leopard knew where the shadows were the deepest and merged beautifully in them. The only sound it made was the occasional intake of breath. It was a hunter, predator, master of disguise. Meanwhile, Mrs. Zimmerman was returning home from dinner at the ladies' club. There were still a few people in the streets, but no one took any notice of the sour-faced older lady. No one saw or heard the predator, who had slipped down the side alley and reached the steps of the teacher's house. The big cat sat there silently waiting with all the patience of an obedient schoolgirl, just biding its time. When Mrs. Zimmerman saw the leopard on her steps, she dropped her handbag and opened her mouth to scream, but her voice wouldn't materialize. Before she could try again, the leopard sprung at her throat, broke her neck, and dragged her into the bushes. As the werecat looked at the woman's now lifeless, ruined body, it felt an array of emotions, but most prominent was the knowledge that the teacher would never scorn another student for not having the same wealth and opportunities as others. The leopard took a final look at its prey and then padded off into the night. The next morning, Stella and Gloria stopped at Vita's house as usual to pick her up so they could walk to school together. Vita was seated on her porch with her back faced towards the outside. She was wearing long pajamas and sipping from a big mug of hot tea. "Aren't you coming to school today?" the girls asked Vita. "No, not today. I'm not feeling up to it. I am sure Mrs. Zimmerman will be very cross." Vita smiled mysteriously as she turned around to face the girls. "Don't worry about her. I'm sure she has taken a very long holiday." Stella and Gloria looked at one another, but just shrugged and headed off to school. Stella called back, "Well, feel better and enjoy whatever you've been eating. Looks like you've got strawberry jelly on your chin." Vita waved goodbye and licked the blood from her chin. Her friends couldn't see her arms and legs under the clothing. She was glad the full moon was over and knew she would sleep well that night. And as for next month, well, Vita already had another deserving victim in mind. Have you ever felt belittled by a trusted adult or a superior at work? What did you do? Would you ever consider plotting revenge? Police work can be rewarding, thrilling, and extremely difficult, and that's when they're dealing with humans. But what happens when something, rather than someone, is taking out the bad guys, as in this story written by Janine Pipe? Detective Cameron Anders rubbed his hands over his face, his expression one of resignation. The scene was all too familiar. 3 bodies, 1 female, 2 males. All 3 victims had been drained. Not a single drop of blood remained in their bodies. His partner, Detective Kate Ramsey, wrinkled her nose as she shuffled across the room in the forensic suit worn to keep the scene intact, and she was pissed. "How many more innocent people before we catch a break on this?" she asked. "This guy has got to be the most prolific serial killer the state has ever had." Gesturing at the bodies, she added, "And the most messed up? Where's the goddamn blood?" She shook her head in frustration, muttering under her breath and storming off. Cameron sighed. It was now up to the CSIs to take care of collecting the evidence. He joined Kate outside, angrily inhaling a black coffee. "We've got nothing," she raged. throwing her paper cup on the ground. She was an excellent detective, but needed to get away from the carnage to think straight. Cameron opened the squad door and gestured for her to get in. Her radio crackled as she sat down, and she gave him the stink eye, as if he were somehow in control of dispatch now too. Deciding upon a childish approach to break her out of the stupor, he stuck his tongue out and blew a raspberry. The move had the desired effect, and she laughed and shook her head as they headed back to the precinct. "I just don't get it." Kate slammed a fist onto the desk. "I know the CSIs are working overtime on this, but where is the blood?" Cameron looked at his partner, chewing the end of his pencil, deep in thought. "The kill scene must be somewhere else. It doesn't make a lick of sense for a whole body's worth of fluid to be missing. It's the only thing that seems plausible." They had spent a long day going over and over the crime scene and comparing it to the others. The killing spree had been going on for months now. With an ever-increasing body count, they knew the feds would be breathing down their necks soon enough. The pressure was inevitable. It was a matter of when, not if. Cameron read Kate's mood and knew it was pointless trying to get anything else done now. They'd hit the proverbial wall. Deciding to call it a day, he suggested they go home, rest, and come back in the morning with fresh eyes. As he was driving home to his out-of-town apartment, Cameron spotted a car with plates he recognized. It had been used in a child abduction case, and he was pretty sure it still had an active bolo. He tailed it with caution for a short time, not calling it in just yet. The vehicle slowed as it neared some woods. He turned off his lights so as not to be seen, his suspicion mounting. Watching closely, he saw a man exit the car and head to the rear of the vehicle. Cameron put his hand to his hip, reassured by the presence of his service pistol. Although his line of sight was now slightly obscured, he could see the man open the trunk, pull something out, and carry it in his arms into the woods. Cameron exited his car carefully. He pulled his radio, which was active, but set to mute, from the glove compartment and followed the suspect into the forest. Now, he could see what the man was holding. Despite years of experience and many previous cases just as abhorrent, a cop never gets over finding a dead kid. Rage took over common sense and procedure as Cameron fought the urge to pull the trigger. But something stopped him, spoke to his cop's intuition, and told him to stand by. And, as per usual, that second sight was correct. Another figure was stepping out of the darkness. Craning to see who the newcomer was, Cameron listened with intent, waiting for his chance. Along with the second voice came a sense of recognition and confusion. He could only suppose it was some kind of honey trap that he'd not been privy to, despite the unlikelihood. Yes, it had to be. Any other reason was incomprehensible. He'd just wait a moment and then rush back in as backup. And then it happened. Even with the coppery tang in the air, his mind wouldn't process the scene unraveling before him. He closed his eyes and pressed his hands over his ears, yet he could still hear the gurgling and glugging. He shook his head like a kid refusing to believe it was bedtime, and then there was an unmistakable thud as the perp's body hit the ground. It was over. A lone whimper escaped his lips as he sensed, rather than saw, the presence next to him. The blood must have given her some sort of superhuman strength, as she was able to wrench him from his crouching position with ease.
"Look at me,"
she hissed, placing emphasis on each word. He didn't want to. He willed his eyes to stay shut, but he knew that sooner or later he would have to face the facts. Standing so close he could smell the blood on her breath, he opened his eyes and was greeted with a sight that would haunt him forever. The thing resembled Kate, but any sense of humanity within her eyes was gone, replaced by crimson bloodlust. Her teeth, or what was more accurately her fangs, were dripping blood like a leaky faucet. In fact, her entire lower jaw was scarlet. Yet, as terrified as he was and certain of his imminent demise, he saw the crimson leave her eyes and the original hue return, even more vital. The retraction of her fangs. She was still covered in blood, but the immediate threat to his life appeared to have lessened. His heartbeat began to return to a regular pace, and he managed to open his mouth to speak, hoping actual words would appear and not remain stuck to his vocal cords. "Kate, what?" Of course, he didn't get to finish his question. She watched with apathy as her partner's body slumped down the tree he had been resting against, the fatal head wound leaving a distinct track of viscera and brain matter. Shame, I'm no longer hungry, she thought to herself. She didn't like to waste a meal. The euphoria from the feed had dissipated, and she was able to think straight. Having worn gloves as always, prints weren't an issue, and she was so light on her feet, there was no trail of footprints. Using Cameron's revolver, Kate shot the already dead child killer in the chest and head. Walking back to her car parked at the opposite end of the woods, she may have experienced something akin to sorrow for the inevitable dog walker who would find the remains in the morning, if she had been able to feel such emotions. It was ironic that she and Cameron would be called to attend. Unless the patrol officer who responded thought to check for ID, they'd never be able to tell from his non-existent face. Kate sighed as she reached her car. At least another dirty lowlife was off the streets. Shame about Anders, but he was collateral damage, and it wasn't as though she was capable of remorse. After all, she was dead and devoid of emotion. She might be able to act the part and react in an unexpected manner, drawing on memories of sentiments from long ago. She could cry, feign joy, rage, elation, but it was all an illusion, part of her cover, and she couldn't be discovered. Not when there was still so much work to be done. Becoming a cop was her best move yet in over 500 years on this planet. She got to feed and satisfy her bloodlust, moving from state to state, city to city, using expert skills honed as homicide detective to glean insider information from cops and snitches alike. The man in the woods had been her preferred choice of dinner, having been a mother herself many centuries ago. She still longed for children, but she never would sire, never force another to live this way. Detective Kate Ramsey actually believed she was helping the world, even if occasionally there was an unexpected hiccup. After all, it was she who was ridding the world of monsters. What would you do if you discovered your friend was taking the law into their own hands, only instead of hurting people, they were saving them from monsters? Would you still be tempted to report them, or would you want to help the cause? There are hundreds of stories of spirits reaching out to those who have wronged them from beyond the grave. Sometimes the circumstances of their death can be tragic. They continue to enact revenge against anyone who is foolish enough to cross them, as in this true account inspired by the story of James Pruitt from Kentucky. It was June 1938 when a man named Carl Pruitt came home from work one night and discovered his wife was having an affair. While her lover escaped by jumping out of a window, the wife was not so fortunate. Overcome with rage at the betrayal, Pruitt strangled her with a small piece of chain. However, almost immediately after, perhaps instantly regretting his actions or maybe not being able to live with the shame, Pruitt committed suicide. He and his wife were quickly laid to rest in separate cemeteries. Both graves were marked, his with a very simple headstone. But soon something strange started to happen. A few weeks after he was buried, visitors to the cemetery began to notice the pattern of a chain slowly forming on Pruitt's plain headstone. The chain was caused by an unusual discoloration in the stone. It appeared slowly and steadily, gaining links until it formed the shape of a cross, and then it just stopped. Some locals were unnerved by this inexplicable event and called for the marker to be removed from the graveyard and destroyed. It was the devil's work. But town officials refused, not believing anything supernatural was occurring, more likely an act of vandalism. And so the newly decorated headstone remained despite whispers of it being cursed. A month or so later, a group of young teens were riding their bikes past the cemetery one afternoon. One of them, a boy named James Collins decided to throw a few rocks at Pruitt's cursed headstone, joking with the others that he wasn't afraid of silly ghost stories. Collins had an excellent aim, and the rocks managed to chip several spots from the headstone. Collins cheered, pleased with his victory. As the young men continued home, Collins' bicycle suddenly began to pick up speed, to the point he could no longer control it. It veered off the road and collided with a tree, but then things took a dark and inexplicable turn. The bicycle chain had come loose and somehow, almost impossibly, managed to wrap itself around a boy's neck. He desperately tried to pull it off, but it got tighter and tighter until finally it strangled him. Rumors quickly spread about the tragedy, especially after an examination of the Pruitt tombstone revealed that no marks or chips marred the surface of it. The other boys knew what they had seen, however, insisting the grave had been damaged by Collins. James Collins' mother was especially heartbroken over her son's death. As a local, she knew about the mysterious cross that had appeared on the headstone and believed her son's friend's account. Less than a month after James' death was officially ruled an accident, she went out to the cemetery and destroyed the Pruitt grave with an axe. She hacked at the headstone until it was ruined, only chunks of stone and rubble remaining. She hoped that would be an end to the curse. The following day, she was hanging laundry on the washing line, which was unusually made from a small link chain rather than the usual rope or wire. Somehow, despite it being a dry day, she slipped and fell. Just like James, her neck became entangled in the chain. She twisted and tried to get free. But as with her son and the bike chain, the struggle was futile. Mrs. Collins was strangled to death, and just as the Pruitt headstone had shown no sign of being damaged by hurling rocks, again there was no evidence that it had been destroyed by an axe. The tragic demise of the Collins family was soon well known far and wide within the town. Again, locals called for the headstone to be removed and the grave to be relocated. But with no actual evidence, only rumors and hearsay, permission was denied. But that didn't stop the fear. A few months later, a farmer and his family were driving a wagon past the cemetery. The farmer exclaimed loudly that the rumors were rubbish and he had no fear of such things as ghosts. To prove his point, he fired several shots at the Pruitt headstone with his revolver. Pieces of stone flew from it as the bullets hit the mark. This in turn spooked the horses pulling the wagon, who began to gallop away as fast as they could. Faster and faster they ran, and very soon the wagon was out of control. The family members all jumped to safety, but the farmer hung on, not wanting to lose the wagon or his horses. Although he held as tightly onto the reins as he could, one of the wheels bumped over a pothole in the road, and the farmer was thrown from his seat. His neck snagged on one of the wheel chains, and as the horse didn't stop, his neck was snapped. Once again, Pruitt's headstone showed no signs of the damage despite the farmer's family having seen the bullet strike it. There were 2 more chain-related deaths that occurred within the vicinity of the Pruitt grave. A police officer who was sent to investigate and mock the stories died in a car accident after leaving the cemetery. Somehow his head had been almost decapitated by a piece of chain. Then, despite the death toll rising, a man named Arthur Lewis still decided to take matters into his own hands. He took a hammer and smashed the headstone to pieces. He seemed to think that if the headstone was destroyed beyond repair, then all the silly stories might disappear too. Residents nearby the cemetery attested to hearing the banging as the marker was reduced to rubble. They also heard the scream not long afterwards. Lewis was found next to the gates. The long chain that was used to lock them had been wrapped around his neck. He was dead, and the headstone so many had heard being struck, good as new. After this last death, families began removing their deceased relations and having them reburied again in other locations. The town grew tired, and soon the living began to relocate too. The small burial plot was forgotten. Since Pruitt had no family left to care for his grave, the site became overgrown, uncared for. Then, in 1958, it was destroyed for good by a strip mining operation. The 5 strange deaths, all linked by chains, were never explained. Could they have simply been tragic accidents? Was it all one big coincidence? Or was Pruitt, a vengeful man in life, continuing to act out against those who wronged him even in death? Would you be brave enough to visit a cursed grave? What would you do if your friends were all going? Would you join them? Or would you rather stay safe and away from possible tragic accidents? This week's podcast stories were edited by Sarah Lukasiewicz, narration by Blair Bathory, audio edited and mixed by Fitz Harris, additional audio editing by Calvin Linderman, produced by Anna Villalobos, executive produced by Gail Gilman, music by Sapphire Sandalo and Calvin Linderman.